It seems to me that I have always known this, and that I came into this world knowing that you become what you think about, whether you want it or not. I was really very blessed. I lived in an orphanage until I was 10, in a series of foster homes, with my older brother, but he was sick quite a bit. He was very anemic, and I used to have to help him as a young boy. He was 16 months older than I was, and this was when I was 4, 5, 6, and 7, and so on. And I can remember I lived out in Mount Clemens, Michigan, at 231 Town Hall Road, with a lady. Her name was Mrs. Scarf, and she had a lot of children would come and go from there. And I was in a foster home because the circumstances at that time were such that my father had walked out on his family, and I was born in the Depression, and there was no welfare and things like that in those days. So it was like people just helped each other out. And my mother was working as a candy girl in Detroit, on the east side of Detroit, earning $17 a week, and she just didn't have the money and wasn't able to provide for her children. So we lived out at this one particular place, and I can remember whenever a new child would come to the house, they would always say, "Go find Wayne." And I would be out in the back. They had orchards there, and this was no hardship. This was no difficult thing for me. This was a great blessing, I think, in my life. Those earliest days. And I can remember a girl named Martha came, and they were dropping her off for basically the same reasons that we were dropped off there. And they said, "Go find Wayne." And I came and I started talking to Martha, and she was crying, and she was all upset, and she was sad, and I was trying to convince her that she didn't have to be sad, that this was, and I remember saying to her, "This is a great place, there's no parents here. You can do pretty much anything that you want. I mean, you've got a lot of freedom, and we're going to have a great time." And I can remember being in school, at the public school. It was a numbered school. They didn't even name them in that day. It was PS number 127, and I remember the teachers, one time we were out on the playground and all the kids were all upset, and I said, "What's wrong?" And they said, "Well, the teacher said this is the worst class that she ever had," and she was so all upset, and she was angry, and she was hurt, and I said, "Well, why would you allow her opinions to have anything to, if this is her hardest day, then her life is just easy, and I can remember talking to other people about, all you have to do is change the way you think. And it goes from being a miserable experience or a tough experience or a hard experience to one that you can do anything that you want with. And when my mother got our family all back together again when I was nine, almost 10 years old. And I can remember her telling me what it was like when I was just a baby, when I was just like an infant, that I was the one child that could make everybody else laugh. At times when everybody else would. She said we were waiting for a bus one time when we were just real babies before I went into the orphanage, and she said a car came by, and it was in Detroit, and there was all this slush, and we all went flying down. Everybody had dirt on them and dirty snow, and we were laying in the ground, and everybody was crying. And she said, "You were and upset and mad because our clothes were wet and so on." And she said, "You just stood up and said, this is great, isn't this wonderful? Look, we don't have to do this, and we don't, just turning it into something positive." It's like, so the ability to be able to do that was something. I can't remember a time in my life when I didn't know that if I really went to work on how I thought, that things just didn't have to be bad. I was the richest kid in the orphanage. I've talked about that many times in my lectures. That a snowstorm was a time we had 2 snow shovels at the home, and one of them had the edges all curled up from hitting the curbs, and you couldn't make any money with that one. So the other one, when it would snow, I would go downstairs and I would take the good snow shovel and I would put it under my bed, and I'd sleep with it right with me in the bed so that nobody else would get it. And I would get up before everybody else got up, and I would go out and I would just shovel everybody else's snow, shovel the walk. And then later on, and I'd just go knock on the door and just tell them that I shoveled their walk, and they'd say, some would say thank you, and some would give me a dime, which doesn't sound like much, but that's about $3,000 in today's money. And when I found out that soda pop bottles, for example, were worth 2 cents each, that if you took them back, you could get 2 cents back, that was just like one of the great awarenesses and awakenings of my life, because I would follow people around who were drinking a Coca-Cola and say, you almost done with that? They said, well, no, I'm not. Well, just whenever you're in, I just follow them. And said, we'll walk until, and I had we had a coal bin where we lived, because it was coal furnaces, and we filled that coal bin with soda pop bottles, and I would take it back. It was just always easy to change, and all the other kids would be not having any money and complaining about not being able to have abundance or be able to have some level of being able to buy themselves like just a little donut or a Pepsi Cola or something. They couldn't figure it out, and it always seemed so easy to me that all you had to do was just look around and see the opportunities in anything, and it had nothing to do with whether there are opportunities there. There always are opportunities. You know, I'm 67 years old. I have never ever been unemployed, or even can't even deal with the concept of unemployment. It isn't that I've had no job. I've always had more jobs than and it isn't because I've been through all good economic times. There've been some pretty sour economic times over the last 50 years or so. I just have never known how to think any other way than if you change the way you think about things, you can create whatever it is you want for yourself in your life. It's just a simple knowing. I mean, I've made a living talking about it. I've written lots of books about it and so on. But I have always lived it and practiced it, and I still do today. It was Thomas Troward. I don't know. He did some lectures on mental science way back in the 1907, 1908. He was from Scotland. And one of the things that he said is that the law of flotation was not discovered by the contemplation of the sinking of things. So that, you know, like before the 15th and 16th centuries, all of the ships were made out of wood. Not because iron wasn't available and steel wasn't available, but because there was a belief that wood floated. So therefore you had to make ships out of things that floated. That's literally how and then someone came along and said that it has absolutely nothing to do with what things are made out of. It has to do with the amount of water that is being dispersed. That's what determines whether something will float or not. And I think about that all the time, because it's in the contemplation of what you desire that you create what it is that you want to have for yourself. It's in your willingness to contemplate it, and nothing more, according to Troward and mental science. So that I think about the Wright brothers, you know, 100 or so years ago. You know, it's like, and I said the law of flying was not discovered by the contemplation of the staying on the ground of things. So that these were two people, like for me, to figure out how to get an airplane to fly, and my limited knowledge of all of that, I would probably have contemplated the staying on the ground of things. You know, like this is what happened. But there's somebody came along and contemplated the idea that if you get enough speed going and you have the right design and you get pressure underneath something like this, and you get that this thing is going to lift off the earth. Somebody had to contemplate that idea. And everybody who contemplated that it wasn't possible, that it couldn't work, was a part of why flying didn't take place, because there was no new law discovered in the early part of the 20th century, any more than electricity was discovered by, you know, Thomas Edison or anyone like that. I mean, the ability to have electricity has always been there. Somebody has to contemplate. So it's like in your own personal life, your willingness to contemplate yourself as a person who is capable of attracting into your life what you want, having the kind of relationships that you want, being able to have abundance where you know, scarcity always exists. All you have to do is begin the process by being willing to contemplate the presence of that in your life. And I've always been a person that I can remember throughout my life as someone who could contemplate myself being able to do things that most people couldn't. And I can give you a good example. When my mother got us all back together, and we were living in Detroit, on the east side of Detroit, and we got a new television set. It was a black and white. It was a screen about this big. It was an Admiral, and we had it in our home, and it was like, oh my God, black and white television. You know, you remember Uncle Milty and all and so on. And there was a guy that was on TV. His name was Steve Allen, and he was on The Tonight Show. And I was 11, 12, 13 years old. I was born in 1940, so I was 51 or 52. And I used to stay up every night and watch The Tonight Show. Even though I had to go to school the next day, there was just something about that show, and all of the characters and smock and all the things that Steve Allen would do on it. And I would come down when I would be talking the next day, and I would be telling my mother and my two brothers that when I do the Tonight Show, this is what I would say. I wouldn't have said what Louis and I say, the way reacted, how he reacted. That I would have said this, and I used to do this. And my brothers and my mother would say, "That's just Wayne. He's just nutty. He thinks he's on the Tonight Show. He thinks he's going to do the Tonight Show." And I would go up into my room at on this little tiny house that we lived in, a little 2-bedroom house that 5 of us lived in because my mother remarried, and I would see myself doing the Tonight Show. I would just practice it, and Steve Allen became someone that I was really enamored of. Well, fast forward, I don't know, 30 years or whatever, and I've written a book, Your Erroneous Zones, and the Tonight Show calls, and they ask me if I would like to come on and do it. So I do my first stint on the Tonight Show. I did the show like 37 times over a period of 3 or 4 years with all these different hosts, but Johnny Carson was on, and the first guest on the very first show when I did the show was Steve Allen. And it was like something clicked in me that I had contemplated that as a child. I had always had a knowing, and I can remember sitting there talking to Johnny about this thing that, and Steve Allen was sitting there right next to me, and we were talking about that kind of thing. So that by putting my attention on something, it wasn't some deliberate thing that I was doing, when I was 11 or 12 years old that was designating that I was going to be a person who was going to be appearing on talk shows 30 years from now. It was just an awareness a willingness to contemplate myself in that kind of a place. And I think the power of contemplation is the thing that most people haven't harnessed yet. And when you harness it in your life, there's absolutely no limit to what you can attract into your life. If you absolutely stay focused on what it is that you're going to manifest and attract, you're not going to do it in your time. Jackson Browne sings a song that says, "And creation reveals its secrets by and by." I mean, you can't push the river. It's all done in divine time, but it will show. It will show. It will manifest. It will attract itself. And I'm never surprised any longer about anything that I put my thoughts on that I can attract it into my life. I just absolutely know that law of attraction and that it absolutely works. And I have absolutely no doubt about it. And I feel as if before I even came into this world, when I was in the world of spirit, that I had a conversation with God. And it was God saying to me, what would you like to do in this lifetime? And I said, well, I'd really like to spend a lifetime teaching self-reliance. Because that's truly all I've ever done since the time I was just a little boy, through all my life. I mean, I could just go through all of the things that I've done. It's been always about teaching self-reliance. And God said, you're sure you want to spend a whole lifetime teaching self-reliance? I said, yeah, that's what I wanted. And he said, well, we better get your little ass into an orphanage then. Rumi said, this ancient Persian poet, brilliant, beautiful poet, he said, sell your cleverness and purchase bewilderment. It feels like bewilderment. It feels like awe. It feels like, even as I think about it now, I can feel myself tearing up behind my eyes, because only I know what is going on behind my eyeballs. It feels like so glorious and so sweet and so trusting, so knowing. There's just this powerful knowing that you're not alone. There's this. That it's like there's a safety, there's a sense of that you're not alone. I had this great experience years ago. There's a friend of mine, he's on KTAR, a radio station in Phoenix. His name's Pat McMahon, Irish Catholic guy. And Mother Teresa is to be his guest, right, on the same day that I'm his guest. So we're in the studio, and Mother Teresa comes in. Now, she's about 4'10", maybe weighs 80 pounds. And she's there to talk about a homeless shelter that she slept in the night before, to tell the people of Phoenix about this homeless shelter. And I'm there to talk about a book that I don't know which one it was. It was 10, 15 years ago. And So Pat tells Mother Teresa, is there anything that I can do for you? And you can imagine the bewilderment and the awe that this is an Irish Catholic guy from, living in Phoenix, and Mother Teresa, a saint, is coming there, and he's just bewildered. He's beyond bewildered. He just doesn't know what to do with himself. He's just so honored. And he says, "Is there anything I can do for you? Is there anything I can do?" And she said, "No." She said, "I just came here to talk about the homeless shelter." He said, "But Mother Teresa," he said, we have a 50,000 watt clear channel station that goes in every direction." And it was like he's got his ego involved. Like we can help you to raise a lot of money for your work and your mission in Calcutta. And she said, "No, I'm not interested in raising money or your radio station getting a." She said, "I just want to talk about the homeless shelter, that's all." And he's exasperated. And finally he's down on his knees. Really. And finally she says, "Stand up." She said, "You seem so serious." She said, "There is one thing that you can do." And he just stood up and he said, "Well, what is it? I'd do anything." She said, "Well, tomorrow morning," she said, "get up at 4 a.m. And she said, and go out onto the streets of Phoenix and find someone who's living there, who believes that he's alone, and convince him that he's not. That's what you can do." And behind the feeling we're talking about here is this feeling of aloneness for so many people who are lost in the world, that I don't have like a connection to something greater than myself. I've come to believe that who I am is what I do, and what I have, and what other people think about me, and who I am is separate from everybody else, and who I am is separate even from what I'd like to attract into my life, that I'm separate from all the things that are missing, and I'm separate even from God, and that there's a place within me that knows that I'm not separate from any of that, that if there's no place that God is not, or that source is not, or the energy that provides, that is always giving and always creating is not, if there's no place that it is not, then it has to be in me. I know that. And if there's no place that is not, and it has to be in me, it has to be also in everything that is missing in my life, or that I think is missing. It's there too. So that in some mysterious, invisible way, I'm already connected to everything that's missing in my life through something called spirit. And when I recognized that I'm not here as this human being having a spiritual experience, when you recognize that your essence is that you are a spiritual being having a human experience, not the other way around, when you really get that, I mean, not that you can say it and it's clever, but when you know that who you are is this essence, you don't see, there's no other, there's no them. There's nothing outside of you. You're connected to everyone and everything. As the Native Americans, you'd say that no tree has branches so foolish as to fight among themselves. Living the Tao Te Ching, this 2,600-year-old, some people call it the greatest, the wisest book ever written. It speaks so much about relationships. Tao, the word Tao means the great way. It's really just another synonym for God, or source, or spirit, or that which is the all-creating. And one of the things that it says that was really helpful to me, probably the most helpful thing in it, was that whenever you have a conflict of any kind in any relationship, whenever you have a conflict, that the person who is willing to be of Tao, of God, of source, is the one who will practice forgiveness, or will go to the person that they have a conflict with and bring love to it, instead of the freeze out, instead of the anger, instead of the hatred, instead of the revenge, instead of so many of the things that we do when we have conflicts in our lives. We just don't talk to that person. Like, I'm not talking to that. I'm not talking to him. He's going to call me because I called the last time. And but the person who lives the Tao life, the life of a higher consciousness, is the person who says, I end all conflicts on love, which is where we all come from. We come from a source that is love. So for me, that has been just so useful. I have 8 children, and that's been just extraordinarily helpful for me to be in a relationship where I can always be of love, where I can just, and so then you don't even, conflicts become something that are no longer present, because conflict requires two-ness. In order to have a conflict, you have to have two different opinions or whatever. But if you live in oneness, if you really see yourself in everyone else, see yourself in all the things, including the plants, including the animals, and including all beings and so on. If you just suspend this ego part of you and just see yourself in that other person, then your arguments are really with yourself, and your hatreds are really about yourself. And you begin to really see that I don't have to project anything onto anyone else that isn't what I choose to be.